Today, we're honored to welcome Dr. Julia Sadusky, a licensed psychologist, author, and speaker who brings both clinical wisdom and a deep commitment to the Catholic Christian faith. Dr. Julia runs a clinical practice in Colorado where she provides therapy for individuals, couples, and families, as well as consultations on sexuality, gender, and mental health. She works closely with churches, counseling centers, and Christian institutions to offer trauma-informed, faith-congruent education and support, especially around complex topics like gender identity, sexuality, and faith integration. She's the author of Start Talking to Your Kids About Sex and Talking with Your Teens About Sex, a practical guide for Catholics, and has co-authored several other books on gender identity and faith, including the book we'll be talking about today, Gender Identity and Faith. With a doctorate in psychology from Regent University and an undergraduate from Ave Maria University, Julia brings a thoughtful, compassionate voice to conversations where both truth and grace are needed. Julia, thanks for joining me today. I've actually been wanting to talk to you for a while about your book, Gender Identity and Faith, which I have and I read when it came out. And what I loved about this book is, there are a lot of books around kind of the theology, politics, law around gender identity, around psychological practice generally, around what does Catholic teaching have to say about gender, but there's not really much out there in terms of kind of practical clinical guidance or writing about clinical experience from experts who really focus on the psychology of kids in this area. And I just thought this book, it was nice because it was a book written, I think, for practicing mental health professionals, but was not overly technical and actually was very accessible for people like me who are interested but haven't been trained as psychologists. People may not be aware of your practice and what you do, so I was wondering if you could maybe just share with us maybe the story of a client who had come to you in your practice. What does your work with them look like?
Yeah. So in this space in particular, right, people will come to see me, let's say a minor, let's say a 16-year-old natal female who's coming in and is exploring questions around gender. Maybe somebody who has a history of depression and anxiety, but Christian parents, so often are hesitant to bring a kid or a teen to therapy. And so it really has to rise to a certain threshold before they're willing to kind of come see a mental health professional some of the time. And so, we could just make up a fake name, but let's say Jamie comes in 16, has a history of depression and also has been questioning gender since about age 13, so right around puberty. And many of the Christian parents I see today are coming into me and they're really trying to understand, how are you going to help our child? Are you going to kind of push them along a certain pathway? Or are you able to effectively treat their mental health concerns and help them with the gender piece so that they're not making decisions based on, what other people want them to do, but really exploring gender without a fixed outcome?
Yeah, and could you just, this hypothetical person, let's say that they want to explore what transitioning could look like, but then they also have these other areas of their mental health that they want to look at and explore. But at the same time, they're navigating their relationship to their faith. Maybe let's say that they're a Catholic and they think that they want to commit to Catholic orthodoxy, but they're also raising questions there. How does the work proceed for someone with that kind of context?
Sure. So, yeah, I would say a lot of teens today are really curious about transition-related steps. I mean, so often now there's a lot of information available to them about what that could look like. There's a lot of messaging that is really helpful and really effective in helping people manage gender questions or gender distress. And so, a lot of my approach, honestly, is really helping people effectively treat co-occurring mental health concerns, usually first, just so that they're getting really effective mental health care. I think a lot of times on all sides of the political debate around gender, there can be a fixation on gender at the expense of the kind of holistic health of a person. And so if somebody's never come to therapy, we're doing what we would do with anybody else, which is helping with distress tolerance, emotional regulation, if there's panic attacks or difficulties with school and peers and social support, we're building all of that up because a lot of the steps people may consider around coping with gender can be helpful in some ways and challenging and stressful in others. And so we really want to make sure, somebody like Jamie is really in a really stable or as stable as a spot as they can be to really effectively kind of navigate and think through some of those pieces. And as you mentioned, Chris, like a lot of people really do want to learn about their relationship with God and how that fits with all of this. And so some teens, I will say, will be skeptical of working with a Catholic therapist because they're afraid that the therapist is going to come in and just kind of force their hand or try to control their faith journey. And so I do a lot of naming for the young people I meet with that if I just tell them what I think or what they should do with all of this, I'm just one more source of authority telling them what I think. And if that was what they needed to figure this out, they would have figured it out before they came to therapy. And so I think a lot of teens are really relieved, not just when I say that, but when I show that over time, that it's not really up to me to control how they ask questions or how they answer questions around faith, around a lot of other things. But it's really for them to sort through that internally in community with their pastor, with their youth group, if they're in one, with their family. And I'm just helping remove barriers, I think, to accessing a lot of those supports. So there are questions they might have about faith, but usually those are even more broad than transition questions or moral questions about different ways of coping with distress. I mean, the number one question I hear from teens is, does God like me? Does God love me? Does God think about me? And if I do have gender distress, so let's take this example of Jamie, so a kid like Jamie could say to me, I've prayed to God that this gender questioning would go away because my life would be easier if this wasn't here. And what does it mean if it doesn't go away? Does God not love me? Does he not care? And so just really helping a young person explore those questions of theodicy that so many teens who are Catholic have, but that relate particularly to this space for some teens.
Yeah, that's really interesting and helpful. And I definitely do want to dig in more to kind of the role of the therapist, where faith comes in, where it's appropriate, inappropriate in your role in these relationships. But maybe I just want to kind of, at this time, take a step back. And I want to talk a little bit about your journey into this space. Just knowing a bit about you and having gotten to know you some, my understanding is this is not at all the work that you thought you would be doing when you were younger, when you were in college, when you were thinking about what you wanted for your future. And certainly this is an odd space for someone who identifies as an Orthodox Catholic, for someone who, as I understand, has a love of theology of the body. So could you maybe just share a little bit about how you ended up here?
Sure. You're right. I did not expect this when I was in college. So I went to Ave Maria University in South Florida for undergrad. And, I knew from a young age I wanted to study psychology and be a psychologist. So that was really alive in me. And at Ave Maria, I studied theology of the body, and I was really captivated by really questions around the theology of relationships and human flourishing and what it meant to be a sexual being and to glorify God with our lives. And so that was really, really transformative, I would say, at that time. Now, I did have people in my life who I loved and cared about who were coming out to me as gay or same-sex attracted in college. And that was the first time that I had really wondered about that experience for people. I think I'd had this kind of luxury of at puberty not asking that question. And so I loved people who were asking those questions, and it really captivated my mind for a long time and still does, obviously, to this day. But so I kind of started reading Theology of the Body as if I was the people I loved who were exploring sexuality questions. And I was trying to figure out, does theology of the body apply to sexual minorities? Because what I didn't see in our more common conversations in Catholic culture, I didn't see much that was helpful for people who were asking these questions. So there were certainly pieces coming out through different formats, books and videos about sexuality and sexual orientation and faith, but I felt like nobody was really effectively integrating psychology in that in a robust way. And so that brought me to Mark Yarhouse, who is a clinical psychologist and a specialist, who the book that we're talking about was co-authored by. And I really went to work at Regent, study at Regent, and get my doctorate there because of his research and what I saw him doing at the intersection of faith and sexual orientation. But then, of course, when I got there, it was 2014. And my first year as part of his research team, we actually had to read his book, Understanding Gender Dysphoria. And it was a very interesting cultural moment in 2015 when Caitlyn Jenner came out as trans. And that was right when I was really starting the work in sexuality and gender and research in that space. And so it really struck me. And I remember writing a blog post about it at the time, how Catholics were responding to Caitlyn Jenner and what was being said and a lot of the commentary. And I just felt really convicted that the ways that people were debating and engaging in that conversation was really dehumanizing. And so I was doing youth ministry on the side at the time, and I was hearing young people ask questions about gender. My second year, before I knew it, about half of my caseload was asking questions around gender or sexual orientation. I was seeing a lot of Christian families, and it became very apparent to me that most clinicians don't have that experience of working with so many Christians in this space. And to be honest with you, that just really expanded my heart for people asking questions about gender. And then because I was seeing so many clients, Mark and I started collaborating on speaking and writing more together. And I had the youth ministry experiences. So I brought in some kind of practical guidance, I would say, about walking with teens in particular. And obviously, as we can look back over the last decade or so, gender has really expanded in its categories and in kind of how many people are exploring it, at least in kind of Western culture. And so it's really become kind of an interesting moment to be in a position to speak and weigh in on some of these pieces.
Yeah. And as someone who is a committed Catholic, who, understands what the church has to say about sex and gender and being created male and female and that's studied and engaged with the theology of the body, I imagine that there's probably some natural tension that comes in with working with kids who may have different perspectives or may be moving in and out of these perspectives and may at times make choices that, maybe you wouldn't agree with theologically, or I don't know how you navigate that stuff. But basically my question is, now in your practice, where do you see some of the tensions that come in between with your relationship with Catholicism and the work that you're doing, and how do you navigate some of those tensions?
Such a great question. Yeah, there's definitely no shortage of times in therapy where as a provider, you have what we might call value conflicts or ethical tensions around my own personal convictions, which aren't, I'm not a relativist. So it's not as if, I'm just holding my own personal beliefs and everybody else has theirs and we agree to disagree. I mean, deeply held convictions that we all have bring up a lot of tensions, whether we're practicing as a provider or not. When people, if we care about people in our lives, make decisions we wouldn't make for them. And you can imagine anybody that I walk with in therapy could make and usually does make a lot of decisions that I wouldn't make for them. And so in the realm of gender, there's a couple of obvious ones, I suppose, that come up. One being a lot of teens naturally are pushing back and away from their parents. That's developmental. That's very common. And I think as a faithful Catholic, I do see parents as really critical in the well-being of their children. And that's not solely because I'm Catholic. It's also very supported by the research that LGBT young people really benefit from having strong, supportive relationships with their parents. So when teens are really unwilling to engage with their parents in a kind of open way, even though I can very much understand that. I think that's one tension for me, is trying to hold helping a teen differentiate while also helping bridge gaps of communication and bolster those relationships when possible. I would say another maybe obvious one that's more culturally focused on right now is questions about medical transition. I think many teens today who are exploring gender do wonder about that. They wonder about hormones. They wonder about surgeries. Now, I will say most people in their teen years, and even most people in the broader culture and mainstream kind of queer culture, don't medically transition. But I do think many teens wonder about that, and they ask questions about that. And some, have a really hard time appreciating how fertility can be impacted by some of those interventions. And so I think that would be another point of tension that can come up for Catholic providers, certainly have come up for me, which is how do we hold kind of the weightiness of fertility and kind of the human body while also accompanying somebody who maybe is saying, I don't really care about that. That's not important to me. So I think there are tensions like that. And then maybe on the other side, tensions when I hear Christian and Catholic parents representing the faith in a way that I think is not accurate. So sometimes because this is so politicized, I think many parents, unfortunately, are so shaped by political ideologies. And so they can really kind of come in with a heavy hand and superimpose things on faith that aren't really aspects of our faith and take things further than what our faith would say about some of these pieces around gender. And so there's tensions there for me in that, feeling like sometimes people misrepresent our faith and justify behaviors that are harmful because of faith when I would disagree and how that's being applied.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, one thing, interesting things that you said is, that for youth who have these experiences, they're very interested in transitioning or have questions around it, but actually a lot of people don't. And one of the common kind of culture war talking points is essentially, if you affirm trans identities, then everyone's going to get castrated, right? Which is, not what the research currently says. But I just want to talk a little bit about kind of your approach to these conversations. I really loved in this book what you had to say about like finding a plateau and working from plateaus with kids as opposed to this mountaintop view that a lot of people will bring in when they initiate these conversations. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so some of my clients just love to roll their eyes at this idea because we talk about it a lot in therapy. And so the whole idea, right? I live in Colorado and I love to hike. And if you ever hike a mountain, you know that there are false summits or plateaus along the way. So these are really kind of flat grounds on the way to a mountaintop where people stop to rest. And sometimes people stop and they say, I'm good. I don't even need to summit this mountain. The views are great here and I love it here. And maybe I'll set up camp or I'll head back down. And so I use that image. That's you.
I'm like, this is enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
You.
You're like, I got the view. This is better than Minnesota. Right.
Yeah.
So it is really a helpful image, I think, because I do think in our current culture, the framing around even gender affirming care is so often that people with gender distress, people who identify as trans or non-binary, ought to or are expected to all medically transition. And so you could think of that as a mountaintop experience where I'm not going to be satisfied. I'm not going to be able to live in a healthy way until I hit the summit, and the summit being a medical transition. Again, historically and currently, all the research is showing that most people don't medically transition. So if it were true that that was essential, a lot of people would be in pretty bad shape. But what we find is many people actually plateau. They find landing points along a continuum of ways of coping with gender that aren't all medical transition. So what are some of those things? A person may make adjustments to hairstyle or dress or presentation part-time or a lot of the time or all of the time in order to bring down the intensity of distress around gender. So think of a woman who keeps her hair short is a really common example of that, or a man who grows his hair out long, or maybe shaves his legs, things that are kind of more subtle, but have an impact on bodily distress and bodily dysphoria. There are people who make adjustments to a nickname. They would say, I don't want to change my name, but I want to have a nickname that I can go by. There are then people who would make adjustments to their name. There are people who would make adjustments to pronouns, all the way up to, what we know as far as medical steps, hormones, low-dose hormones, or kind of a normal hormonal regimen, or surgical interventions, of which there are many. And so just to kind of highlight that, even as I describe this to you now, I think a lot of times people, when they hear me talk about these options, they hear that they are all kind of morally neutral in my mind as I just neutrally describe them to you. Mm-hmm. And what I want to say about that is the landscape of options that people are weighing and navigating. And so to be kind of neutral as I describe them to you is in the spirit of naming some of the different options. That's not to say that, they all have the same moral and ethical questions that arise, or anything like that, but just to kind of acknowledge these are the things people are weighing on a continuum, and many people find their plateau. And especially in adolescence, I think there's a great value in helping teens find a plateau that's reversible as they're kind of weighing identity questions. These are weighty ones. They're not cavalier ones. And so helping people appreciate the significance of where they are, learning what works and what doesn't, without assuming any pathway in particular, has been really critical in the work I do.
Yeah, one of the things that I've wondered about is, in a lot of Christian spaces, there's this rhetoric that kind of argues that, transitioning is an all or nothing experience. Either you don't affirm anything about this experience, or if you are affirming full medical transition, and it's very binary. And sometimes I wonder about whether that encourages youth to see it that way as well. And for a lot of youth who may work on this and find a plateau with just some like subtle social transitioning and could be happy there, actually feel pressured by Christian communities that when they finally realize this experience isn't going away, then that drives them to be much more interested in full medical transition.
That's so interesting. And I think it's really true. I think the binary black and white thinking exists on all sides. I think you hear that, right? Where Catholic parents will say, I want my kid to be at home in their body. I want my kid to be comfortable in their sexed body and to be accepting of their sexual identity. And when a young person is looking at that task and saying, I don't know how to do that, or I've tried that and it hasn't worked. And then that young person starts to think, well, I might like to change my hairstyle, or I might want to, as a male, wear earrings, or whatever it might be. They start to assume that means something about them and their ability to, quote unquote, accept their sexual identity. And so I think you're right. There can be a pendulum swing there. Even if some of these things we're talking about, there are, I just mentioned earrings, and you laughed, right? Because there are men who have their ears pierced. You would be one of them, right?
Pierced, yeah.
That's right. And so that's a good example of these kind of behaviors or presentations that we would say as Catholics are on a continuum and are kind of available to a lot of people. Hairstyle, I don't think Catholics would hopefully argue that, how you keep your hair means you are more or less a man or a woman, right? Yeah. But sometimes in these conversations, that interpretation comes forward for parents. Oh no, my child's not accepting their sexual identity because they're a boy who likes to try on dresses, or a girl who is not super emotional in the ways we might expect, or doesn't like to cook, or likes rough and tumble play. I mean, some of those gender stereotypes actually are driving, I think, the binary black and white thinking that I think you're right, can then propel a young person who feels like they don't fit that rigid box to feel like the only option for a satisfying life is to go all the way the other direction.
Yeah. This sounds really consistent with a lot of conversations that I've been having with people around, how do you operate in this space? And a lot of people recommend listening, giving space. It makes me think a little bit about your book, Start Talking About Sex, which I also loved and recommend to Catholic parents. And And it also actually makes me think of, I had this conversation with a psychologist, and they said that, a lot of times when parents have a little boy that wants to try on mom's high heels or dresses, if you take too strong or rigid of a position when they do that or shame them over it, that one of the things that potentially could happen developmentally is it could contribute to something like a fetish in those areas. And for a lot of kids, but they just need a space to just kind of play around, and it doesn't mean much more than that.
That's right. I mean, I really appreciate Abigail Favali's kind of reflections on some of this. She talks extensively about how, anything a boy does is masculine because a boy's doing it. And anything
Yeah.
a girl does is feminine when a girl does it because it's a girl doing it. And that's really helpful anchoring for parents that I meet with young children, especially. So they become really anxious about, if I do or don't respond a certain way, if I just allow this to unfold naturally, am I just pushing my child down a path of transition? If I, over respond, am I shaming them? And so there's a ton of fear in these parents. And that fear actually drives them to overreact in ways that are really unhelpful. And you mentioned one, which is a boy playing with dresses or trying on the mom's high heels, which are developmentally very normative for boys to kind of try that at some point. Now, not every boy does, and many boys won't, but it's not uncommon as kids are developing their gender as a young child to kind of try those things on. And parents who overreact in shaming or hiding the high heels really does unintentionally reinforce shame. And shame can actually be a catalyst, as you mentioned, for, yes, a kind of hiding. So a young boy kind of going in the closet and trying on dresses or high heels that can develop into a fetish down the line. I've seen that as well. And so really helping parents in what we call in the book gender patience and kind of scaffolding your child's identity development more broadly in healthy ways, helping the child build a sense of confidence and efficacy, know how to respond if kids make fun of them when they like toys or activities that may be more gender atypical, we'll say. And so really helping support and scaffold around that child so they develop a healthy, stable sense of self that doesn't hinge on their interests falling cleanly in line with what would be kind of a gender norm or gender typical for their sex at that age.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved what you quoted from Abigail Favale about like gender and charity, or masculinity and femininity and charity. It makes me think of I had worked with John Cavadini, who's a theologian at Notre Dame, and one of the things I remember him saying at one point was, he understands masculinity and femininity as charity in a man and charity in a woman. And I think that's been really helpful for me. In a lot of Catholic circles right now, there's this really strong focus on masculine identity and feminine identity, and then an attempt to tie these concepts back to the theology of the body. But then if you actually read the theology of the body, one of the really interesting things is those terms actually never appear in it. He talks about, human identity, personal identity, masculinity, and femininity. But if you trace back the concepts of like masculine identity and feminine identity and where those enter into conversations in the church, that really comes much more from a lineage of kind of like Freudian theories about development and the idea of development culminating in an identity, rather than in the work of John Paul II and a lot of other Catholics who had been writing about masculinity and femininity prior to the last maybe 20 years. They really focus on kind of like vocation, calling, like working within your lived reality, including within your embodied experience. And one of the things that I worry about this hyper focus on masculine identity and feminine identity is I worry that it'll lead to a preoccupation with how one conceives of oneself versus how one experiences in the world and lives out their calling.
That's right. Yeah, I think, so much of theology of the body and what I appreciate most about it is it's an orienting around how our sexed identity is communicative about who we are and who God is, and who we are as the human race, right? That we are made to be gift. We're made to give of ourselves completely and receive God and receive others as a gift. And that actually has very little to do with whether I conform or don't with rigid norms of kind of gender stereotypes. And it even has very little to do with kind of these constructs of in masculine identity, thinking of the masculine identity as the one who initiates or provides, and the feminine identity as the one who receives. The fundamental premise, I think, in my read of Theology of the Body is that the masculine and feminine together tell us something about human vocation, which we are all called to initiate and to kind of move towards relationship, and we're all called to receive. And the man and the woman both are called into that mode of being by virtue of being human. And so I agree with you that I think sometimes the splicing out, which is in an effort to kind of preserve something good, which is the value and integrity of sex kind of personhood, that we are sexed beings, actually reinforces some of the problems that our culture also contributes to in this space, which really roots some of these pieces into something much more reductive than vocation or calling.
Yeah, actually, what you said made me think of another thing that Abigail Favale had written in her book Genesis of Gender. She had this section in it that I loved, where she talked about how, in Catholic theology we have this idea that creation is feminine in relation to God, and given that really part of what women have to offer in their femininity is teaching men how men are to relate to God. And so it's interesting because it brings out kind of this idea of receptivity and action, but then it kind of turns it on its head a little bit and says that actually this is something that men are called to integrate into ourselves as well, which to me feels very Christian. There's the constant paradoxes and turning things on their head. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Sometimes when I speak, Chris, I'll share with people in the room, how often we splice out different aspects, right, of personality traits or features. Women are more sensitive, and that's a strength for women, but it's also a challenge for women. And so they need the man to come in and be rational and reasonable. And, because men, are just less emotional. And I often point out that, the perfect man didn't just cry, he wept.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said about that, right? That perfected humanity is the one who can integrate all aspects of our personhood, the receptive within us, the initiative, and kind of moving towards action within all of us that we're all kind of entrusted with as human beings. And that each of us in our particular sexed identity kind of are offering a call to others, an invitation to others when we move towards virtue in our lives. And virtue has very little to do with a lot of these stereotypes. It has everything to do with something much broader and expansive than what we tend to focus on, I think, in Western culture today.
Yeah. I kind of want to come back to psychological practice again. And connecting it to some of these conversations. So, the other thing that I think about is the rhetoric of masculine identity and feminine identity. I often connect back to what I call the ex-gay narrative, being this narrative where that says that the reasons why one experiences what you've named as kind of gender distress or same-sex attraction, LGBTQ plus identities, is because they experienced some wound earlier in life. For a boy, this wound causes him to not fully accept his masculine identity, which then manifests itself in same-sex attractions because he's seeking masculinity in other people. And then the theory holding that, well, if you can heal the core wound, find an acceptance of your masculine identity, then these desires, identities can or will subside, and you'll come more into heterosexual desires and identities. I would be really curious to hear from you, how do those theories come up with the kids that you're working with? What is your perspective or response to them as a professional, and how does this impact the lives of the kids that you work with?
Yeah, it definitely comes up in my work with these families. I mean, so many Catholic parents come to me and they are looking back in the rearview mirror and they're trying to figure out, what did I do wrong to cause my child to have this challenge around embodiment in the realm of gender, we'll say in particular. And so what I'll say first is, a lot of Catholics, and you've pointed this out extensively, Chris, that a lot of Catholics would not be very friendly to Sigmund Freud. And we don't tend to, in general, agree with a lot of what he has contributed to in the field of psychology. And so a lot of these theories are rooted in pretty Freudian and older psychoanalytic ideas about a kind of arrested development in masculine identity or feminine identity that manifests in pathology later in life. And so I think it's just important to point out, just like with teens who are drawn to gender theory, it's good for them to know that Judith Butler is kind of the leading voice in that, and that theory is non-theistic in origin, right? And in the same way, I think it's good for people who are drawn to some of those causal pathways to know where that theory's origin is, and to take it, not so much to spit it out outright, but to really kind of be critically evaluating, is that accurate? And we don't have robust research to support those theories. And they have been investigated, primarily, though, through case studies. And so I think just being able to acknowledge that is really key. And I tell parents that, we don't have strong research evidence to show, number one, that your child has these questions because of an arrested development. And we certainly don't have evidence to show that if we can help address that arrested development, if it does exist, that will be a catalyst for a resolution of the gender distress. And so in my clinical practice, I've seen a lot of kids with these questions. And, when they have these questions very young, when between the ages of 3 and 6, they have a very felt sense that their body is fundamentally wrong in sex identity. They're not even thinking in the abstract terms of maleness, femaleness, masculinity, and femininity. They have a very strong reaction to their genitalia. That would not be typical for most kids. Disgust responses to their genitalia, a sense that there ought to be different body parts there. And that's really where the diagnosis of gender dysphoria comes in. And I'm not seeing any clear evidence, even in the anecdotal evidence that I have in my work with these families, that the families are causing that disgust response, or the families are kind of causing that type of relationship with the body. So all that to say, I think even in my own clinical practice, I am not seeing that with young children with these experiences. I will say at the same time that for teenagers with a kind of late onset gender distress or gender questioning, there tend to be a lot more factors at play, which makes sense, right? When these things are kind of coming to the surface later, it would make people wonder more about what other factors are contributing to this experience. Even in those cases, I see a whole spectrum of possibilities for what might be converging in any one person's relationship with their body at puberty and after puberty. And to reduce it and to try to kind of fit it within a causal theory that was originally developed around homosexuality, it would be a huge mistake. And so I think a lot of times when we don't know what to do with something in cultures and subcultures, we just like to take the kind of image or the map that we've used with something else that has felt very comfortable and orienting, and we like to superimpose it on something that feels mysterious or new. And I see that happening with these causal theories around gender, that things that did not hold up around homosexuality are now being reapplied to the gender space. And I don't think that they fit cleanly, even if they resonate for some people. And I can be respectful of the ways they may resonate for some people while saying, that doesn't mean that it's everybody's causal path here.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes I think back to, the development of these theories happened alongside the development of the view that people are religious because of a pathology, right? So it's the same argument applied to both. And obviously the psychological community has moved away from that view when it comes to religion, as well as when it comes to homosexuality. But a lot of Christian communities want to hold on to the homosexuality thing, forgetting that the same thing was done to religious people.
I was just going to say one more piece there, that I think when it comes to causal theories, a lot of people want to grab a hold of them because they want to do due diligence in exploring possibilities for what might be contributing to something so painful, and they want to help reduce the intensity of that pain. So I always like to mention, holding loosely these causal theories doesn't mean you don't do good therapy with people in these spaces and explore what may be contributing to some of these challenges for people. But you're not making the promise to people that if we explore and identify some converging factors that may be contributing to some of the challenges with embodiment for people, that's going to be the catalyst for healing. That would be a huge mistake. And so sometimes a critique I get is, because you don't, have a causal theory that you like or that you prefer and hold out, you just let people kind of not think critically about their stories. And that couldn't be further from the truth, but maybe that's also worth mentioning here.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So going in a slightly different direction, I think that on the one hand, there are a lot of Christians who want to do therapy, but they have fears around finding a therapist who will respect their religious convictions and work in accordance with their values. On the other hand, there are a lot of LGBTQ people who want to go to therapy, but they have fears around having these theories pushed on them, or maybe religious views they don't ascribe to being pushed on them. And then, of course, you have LGBTQ people with religious backgrounds and commitments that are hit on both sides. What would you recommend to them as they're seeking out mental health professionals or seeing things within the context of therapy that they don't like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important for people to remember with therapy that you're seeking out a service. So you are paying for the provision of care. And it is really, really easy to just settle for a therapist who does not know how to be effective in these spaces because it feels like there's not an alternative out there. So I really want to embolden people who listen to this to remember that you are consuming a product. And if I were you, because therapy can be quite expensive, I would want to know right out the gate a good bit about the person across from me. I would want to know, first and foremost, is my provider going to therapy currently, or have they gone to therapy in the past themselves? Because a psychologist or a mental health provider who hasn't done their own work is going to be pretty compromised in what they can offer you. Yeah. And that's maybe the first thing. The second thing is I would want to know from a provider how many people with my experience they've worked with. So, how many clients have you worked with who come in with these convictions, maybe with these experiences? And how do you see yourself as being helpful to me in the midst of that? Right. And because there can be helpful clinicians who have seen very few clients with your experience, but that would be the exception. Most of the time, we would want to know that person has some sense of an ability to wrap their mind around what I'm going through. And so being able to vet for that is really key. And then what are the typical pathways or outcomes for people who come to see you who are exploring faith and sexuality or faith and gender? Because if they all slant one direction, that may be good data for you as far as what that therapist is doing or trying to do in therapy. I think just being able to have the therapist give a little bit of an account for the work that they do with people, just like if you had somebody coming to your house to do contracting work, you might want to see pictures of other places that they've worked on. And I think being able to think in those terms is really key, because way too many families, Catholic parents, and Catholic people with LGBT experiences come into therapy in the one down position where there's such a desperation to get help that you feel like you're trying to prove to the therapist why they should work with you and having to give an account for your experience and all the wisdom you've gained and, how you think about it, as opposed to you vetting the therapist for how they're going to show up for you. And Catholic parents in particular, I want to embolden in this because so many are so desperate and they feel like they really need to find a therapist who is subscribing to their beliefs and values. And I often tell people I would take a competent secular clinician over an incompetent Christian clinician every day of the week.
Yeah.
A good clinician can learn to hold your beliefs and values. And if they're not doing that, go find somebody else. But I wouldn't rule somebody out by virtue of their beliefs and values in any direction. And I wouldn't assume they're trustworthy because they share your faith background.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a friend who, she's a Catholic therapist, and she said one of the interesting things is that often it's easier as a Catholic therapist to see people who don't share her religious views because there's this temptation when you see another Catholic in therapy to assume they view Catholicism like you do. And when you do that, you can get a mismatch in values inadvertently. Yeah.
That's for sure. Yes, there's something to be said about that. When I train early clinicians, I often remind them, when somebody talks about their faith and they share your background, be sure to ask more questions than you think you need to ask about what they mean when they talk about it, because you're going to assume that you know what they're talking about because you come from the same background. And so often that's actually a barrier. So when you can have a clinician who's thoughtful and curious, regardless of where they fall, that's really helpful as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, Julia, I'd also be curious for you, as a therapist, I often find it really valuable when therapists are aware of kind of their limitations and know when to refer out. So I would be really curious to hear from you. As a therapist, where do you see your limitations in terms of, where you can help people? What's appropriate for you to take on versus not take on? Because I also think sometimes Catholic therapists in this space will kind of go beyond the bounds of maybe where they have competence or experience because they feel like the client needs to see a Catholic. So how do you approach questions like that?
Yeah. So, again, I already mentioned this, but I actually feel like I would take a competent secular therapist over an incompetent Catholic any day of the week. And I've had people who have seen me for a season, let's say, a person who is gay and they're kind of exploring their values on sexual and romantic relationships. And at some point in therapy, they come to the place where they say, you know what, I want to pursue a same-sex partnership. And it's not so much that I can't or don't or haven't worked with people in that, but I've had clients who share with me that sometimes because they know my beliefs and values, because of my writing and speaking, they like to move into a season with a different clinician who doesn't have those beliefs and values. And we talk about that and we process that. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me, that there are different seasons of therapy with different providers. And I think if one provider is kind of walking with you in one trajectory, and then let's say kind of things shift for you, to have somebody who represents that shift can be really helpful and permission giving. And so I think that would be maybe an example where I've seen that come up where that's been helpful for somebody. Or, sometimes when people are exploring kind of different pathways around gender, I think they want to see somebody who's walked with a ton of people who have pursued surgeries, let's say. And so the percentage of people who do that is rare. The percentage of my caseload who do that is rare. And so I've had people who say, I want to work with a caseworker at this gender clinic because they have really done this with a lot of people. And I think they're going to be really effective with me. And so those are maybe examples of that. But you'll notice, Chris, that it really does have to do a lot with what my clients are needing from me and wanting in therapy. And I want everybody I work with to have the freedom to say yes to working with me and no to working with me, and not have to feel like they have pledged allegiance to our work in a way that they can't leave it when they move on to a different phase. And that's different than me as a clinician saying, hey, I don't want to work with you anymore because you're moving down a trajectory that brings up points of tension for me. That would be a very different piece, I think. And that does come up for clinicians. I just have found, for me in particular, that, I've been grateful to be able to walk with people who do make all kinds of decisions in this space. The only other thing I would add is the realm of like spiritual direction or theological questions for people. it would be very easy as a Catholic clinician who cares about theology to step into those spaces with regularity with people who come to therapy and have questions around theodicy or
Yeah.
moral and ethical questions here. And I really do try to discipline myself in that. It doesn't mean we never create space for those questions, but I'm constantly pointing people back to resources and people in their community who can walk with them in that more deeply,
Yeah.
rather than using our space as if it's a spiritual direction space or as if it's a, healing prayer space. I really try to bracket that and point people to appropriate resources that aren't their therapists for that as well.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, I do want to return earlier. You had mentioned that sometimes kids will raise questions with you like, "Does God like me? Does God love me?" What is your approach when you get those sorts of questions?
Yeah, so actually there are psychological interventions that address that. So I've been trained in something called God image versus God concept. And this is an integrative intervention that we use to try to capture the difference between people's emotional experience of the divine and their cognitive understanding, the Sunday school answer about who God is. And so actually, I resort to psychological interventions that have been developed after researching these experiences for people there. You can use art forms to reflect on how a person feels God sees them when they sin or fall short versus how God relates to them emotionally when they haven't sinned, and the gap there and helping bridge those gaps. So there's actually, again, protocols that I draw from there, as opposed to me as the clinician just simply coming in and saying, of course God likes you. Now, I believe that God does, and I know that God does, and yet that's really not the place for the psychological intervention of just kind of affirming that. If all that person needed was somebody to say, God likes you, they would not be carrying the weight of that felt sense that God doesn't like them.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Good. No, I'm just going to ask you. So could you just? I mean, that's really helpful. I just really be curious. Practically, let's say I think it was Jamie that we were talking about earlier. So, kid with gender distress. So Jamie that we were talking about earlier, kid with gender distress, teenager, Catholic, figuring that out. Jamie has a lot of insecurities around faith. Comes to you and asks, like, Dr. Julia, does God like me? How do you respond to Jamie in that situation?
Yeah. So in that moment, I might say something like, "Oh man, you really don't believe that God likes you, do you?" And Jamie will say, "No, I don't. Why would God like me?" And that's where you hear the self-loathing thoughts, right? God's disgusted by me. What's wrong with me? I'm flawed. Everybody else knows how to be a girl in their body, and I don't know. And if God really liked me, wouldn't he help me? And then I might ask a couple of questions about that, right? How far back do you remember believing that? Really feeling like God doesn't like you? Was it always that way, or was ever a time where you felt like you and God were on good terms and it didn't hinge on you having this figured out? And so you're just kind of opening that up, trying to get at the thoughts and the feelings and the history of that. And then I might ask Jamie, would it be okay if we use art or words on the page to kind of show me how you think God sees you? And so again, I would use prompts for that. On one side of the page, show me you and God. And then on the other side of the page, show me you and God when you do something wrong or when he becomes aware that you have gender distress. Like what's God doing there? Yeah. And then we're just processing, like, look at that. Whoa. What are the impacts of that on a kind of, before you had this distress, maybe you really felt like God was next to you and you're walking and there's sunflowers everywhere and the sun is shining. And then on the other side, you couldn't be farther from God and there's a cliff and you're at the edge of it and God's far away and he looks mad at you in that. And that's a big difference. And then I'm just opening with people, like, what is that like for you on a daily basis to feel like that is how the divine sees you? Because I can tell that you care about God and you want God to be in your life. But it's as if he's this companion that that very kind of precariously turns his back on you by virtue
Yeah.
of something that you can't change.
Yeah.
So we're just really opening that, and
Mm.
then we might do a piece of art, or like, how would
Mm.
you like to experience God?
Mm.
Based on what you know about him in
Yeah.
scripture, what you've heard about him, um, and what difference would that make?
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of it. And then Chris,
Yeah.
also the last thing I'll say is what I hear from clients most of all in God image work is that and this is maybe the value of having a person of faith as your
Mm.
therapist, is
Yeah.
they'll say, I
Yeah.
can start to believe that God
Mm.
likes me because I can tell you like me. And that
Oh,
becomes
wow.
really
Yeah.
powerful for parents too, that
Yeah.
for them to know that what they show on their face towards their child
Yeah.
when they talk about gender, when they explore these questions and other things,
Yeah.
has so much power in shaping a
Yeah.
person's emotional experience of God. And so
Yeah.
clinicians can
Mm.
contribute to that as well, I suppose.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, actually, it makes me think of a good friend who, we were just talking about her dating struggles, and she said, to be honest, one of and also, her complicated relationship with her father, and she said one of the reasons why I still have hope that I can find someone that I can be securely attached to and find love and be supported and feel good in this relationship is because of my relationship with you. And I think this is really something that like friendship can really provide. A good friendship can help us reflect back the love that we want to see in other areas in our lives. The other thing that I thought of as you were talking was, I kind of wonder I think for a lot of us, our experience of God or our view of God's view of us is filtered through our view of ourselves. It's like we're looking through this filter, and how we feel about ourselves, what we receive from God and hear from God about ourselves has to go through that filter. And so I wonder if what therapy does is, they don't change or address what's happening out here, but they can help work on that filter and get more clarity so that we can receive, like I believe in a loving God. So we can receive like the loving God more clearly through that. I also just really, to be honest, really appreciate kind of the humility in the response that you're giving. You're recognizing I have limitations in my role. My profession gives me a limited set of tools, and I'm not going to pretend that I can fix everything. And I'm not going to pretend that it's appropriate for me to try to do everything here. And I really value the humility that often I think expresses itself in like ethical guidelines within the professions.
That's right. We need those guidelines for all of us. And as soon as we start thinking that by virtue of fill in the blank, we don't need those brackets and those kind of boundaries and those scaffolds, any one of us as human beings can really run amok. And I think that's true in psychology and counseling as well.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you, Julia. Yeah, so I think we're probably nearing the end, but I just want to ask you at this point, a couple of things. One, what are you grateful for from your practice and from this unusual work that you do? And then what's your hope for LGBTQ plus kids and the church?
Yeah, I think as far as what I'm grateful for, some of this is maybe self-serving, but I think I was came into the world as a people pleaser and as somebody who
Mm,
really cares a lot about being understood.
mm,
And so to enter into spaces in solidarity with a lot of people who have been really misunderstood deeply and
mm,
rejected deeply has helped kind of build a sense of, I think, self in me that
mm.
otherwise
Ah,
was
yeah.
not so present. And I've witnessed the courage and the resilience of people who have been so villainized and misunderstood. And it has really challenged me to be willing to speak up and to be
Mm,
honest about what's real and true and good in this space, even when it means rejection and misunderstanding. It's kind of forced me to say at the end of the day, whose opinion of me do I care about? And to
mm,
come back to that place that I answer to God. I don't answer even to people I love and respect in my faith community
mm,
who sometimes misunderstand and mischaracterize what I do. And so I think that's really key and been really
mm.
helpful.
Yeah.
I also would say just the people I've gotten to meet with, there's so many incredible families, so many incredible people with LGBT experiences, or families kind of trying to support an LGBT loved one. And to see the courage and the humility and the grace and the compassion and the growth and the kind of healing as far as these relationships go over time has been so emboldening of my faith. And that's something I'm really, really grateful for as well.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and what are you hopeful for the future, for these kids, the church, these spaces?
Yeah, so I would say that I am hopeful tentatively. I mean, I think I'm there's a lot of challenges today in our culture as far as villainizing and dehumanizing the other, whoever they are.
Yeah.
And that is something that we are so prone to as human beings. And I don't think that's going anywhere. But I will say that the presence of LGBT people in our communities, the kind of unwillingness to kind of walk away and the kind of courage to say, like, we're here and we have something to offer. Not just we have something to receive, but we have something to give the body and to build up the body gives me great hope. Because the church suffers when people are not in it across difference. And that gives me hope, the courage of people who stay, the courage of people who take a step back and leave for a time and kind of take space too, gives me courage, because it shows a willingness to really attend to what's needed and a trust that God is not so fragile, that he can't tolerate the journeys that we're on. And then a lot of the Christian parents I meet with give me a lot of hope. There's a lot of parents who come in to see me and they have so much fear and so much anger and feel so protective of their child. And that protectiveness and that anger comes out sideways in really unhelpful ways. And to witness these parents show the humility of Christ, the kind of tenderness of God, the passion to learn and grow, and the spiritual maturity to do better, it really gives me hope for our families and our communities as well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that, Julia. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk with me. I'm really glad that we were able to do this. I loved this book. And as soon as I read it, I knew I wanted to talk to you about it. So thanks for taking the time.
Absolutely, Chris. It's so good to talk to you.